I'm Christina Paulos. I'm Managing Director of the Well News. Thank you all for joining us here this morning. And for those of you joining on live stream, really appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedules and making room for this event this week. We do these events a lot, and I have to say it's always the highlight of any given week to actually connect with folks in person. Sometimes it's easy for us to get bogged down in the extremes dominating the debate on any given day, especially when so much media coverage tends to focus on the views of the far right and the far left. The Well News was created to address this specifically. We know that there are just as many people across the country who have differing opinions, but very good will to work together to find solutions that are collaborative, that address the problems facing our communities and our country. With that said, today you'll hear about different issues that are being worked on, some things that are being missed, and items that are primed for more research in economic and workforce development topics. A lot of you work on these issues every day, so we know this is just the beginning of hopefully what will be many productive conversations long after this event ends. And we wouldn't be able to bring you this event without our sponsors, the Modern Economy Project and TechNet, so thank you to them. I'm going to turn your attention to the 3 screens that are in the room. We'll have a short video and then brief remarks from representatives for the Modern Economy Project. Thanks again.
Hopefully that got you excited and ready for today's conversation. My name's John Stanford. I'm one of the co-founders of the Modern Economy Project. I want to begin with some thank yous, primarily to the Well News team, to Corey and Christina. It's been incredible what you've pulled together today. Of course, to the amazing group at Charlie Palmer, thank you for the incredible service, food, and drinks we have today. Today's speakers, I had the chance to chat with some of them before this, and I think you're in for a real treat as far as thought leadership, a good dialogue. We've got people, policymakers from every level of government, as well as incredible organizations doing work out in the field. Of course, thank you to our attendees from the Hill, from other organizations around town. We hope this is the first of many conversations. And then finally, thanks to the 9 organizations that co-founded the Modern Economy Project with us, many of whom are represented here today, good friends for a long time. And I'm pleased to announce breaking news. We have added our 10th member as of this morning. The National Small Business Association will be joining to help bring more small business voices. And that's what the Modern Economy Project is all about. Our economy is chaotic. There are not hard lines out in the real world, and yet we create a lot of hard lines in our conversations in Washington. And that's a problem that the Modern Economy Project is seeking to solve. On the table in front of you is a one-pager, because it wouldn't be a Washington event without a one-pager. But I think it's pretty interesting. Each of our member organizations contributed an area where they thought the conversation in Washington might be lacking, could be more data-based, could be more open, and there could be more dialogue. And so I hope you'll take a look at the range of views there in front of you. That's, of course, also on our website, which I'll try to plug about 8 times, as I was told to do, and encourage people to sign up for our newsletter so that you can get this data and insights on a regular basis. Our goal is going to be to convene throughout the year. We've got groups that have presence out in the field. I know they sat all the way in the back, but I see Ron and Mel from the workforce boards back there. They have 550 workforce boards around the country. We've got the U.S. Black Chamber sitting here that has chambers throughout the country. So the Modern Economy Project is not focused on dialogue here. It's focused on bringing the dialogue out there to Washington, and we're pleased to be a part of that. And with that, I want to get on to the meat of the program that is pretty exciting, and I'll turn it over to our co-host for today, who we're so grateful who could join us, and Meghan Dorn from TechNet. So please help me welcome Meghan to the stage for some remarks.
Thank you so much, John. On behalf of TechNet, we are pleased to co-host this important event with our friends at the Modern Economy Project. Today's themes of reconnecting policy discussions with economic reality, as well as stories and case studies from across the country, is exactly the kind of dialogue we at TechNet hope to foster. For those not familiar with us, TechNet is the national bipartisan network of technology CEOs and senior executives that promotes the growth of the innovation economy. TechNet's diverse membership includes dynamic American businesses, ranging from startups to the most iconic companies on the planet, and represents more than 5 million employees and countless customers in the fields of information technology, e-commerce, the sharing and gig economies, advanced energy, cybersecurity, venture capital, and finance. You'll note in the handout that John referenced that we are excited to get this data in front of policymakers and stakeholders like everyone here. Today's conversation, featuring speakers at every level of government, is critically important, so thank you all for being here today. With that, it is my pleasure to welcome our next speaker, Connie E. Evans, President and CEO of the Association for Enterprise Opportunity. Thank you for being here, Connie.
Good morning, and thank you, Meghan, as well as John. This is an exciting, exciting morning. When we joined you in the room to launch the Modern Economy Project last year, it was this type of forum we had in mind. AEO, for those of you unfamiliar, we are the National Trade Association and the voice of innovation for microfinance and microbusiness in the United States. That means that we are the voice of millions of Americans running companies with 5 or fewer employees. We joined the Modern Economy Project because we want to ensure the economic power of micro businesses is not ignored. And that is what today and our work is about. Ensuring Washington and Main Street are speaking the same language, regardless of party or affiliation. According to AEO's research, Bigger Than You Think, we found that micro businesses represent 92% of all businesses in the US and generate a whopping 41.3 million jobs with upwards of a $5 trillion economic impact. Despite these numbers, these businesses rarely make headlines. To be of value to the policymakers in the room, AEO will continue to further our research on this important segment of our economy. A good and topical example of why understanding our community is so important is the ongoing discussion around independent contractors. We know that micro businesses rely heavily on independent contractors or are considered independent contractors themselves. And we want to ensure that Congress and the administration bolsters this community in a meaningful way. We look forward to working together with public entities, the private sector, and stakeholder groups in this room to enhance our economy and understand each other's priorities as it relates to workforce policy and how we can align around common goals. We hope that through our participation in the Modern Economy Project as a founding member, we will contribute to the growing debate around workforce challenges and how to address those challenges at all levels, which we are excited to hear more about from Liz Wilke at Gusto shortly. Enjoy today's fantastic discussion. Thanks again to Well News for this convening. I look forward to working with many of you throughout this year.
Great, good morning, everyone. Is everyone caffeinated? Ready to go? All right, excellent. Well, thank you for joining us. The Well News was founded about 4 years ago because DC and the mainstream media don't always reflect the reality experienced by Americans outside of the Beltway. And we found this to be a similar case when looking at the relationships between employers and communities across the country. So today we're going to be reviewing some key case studies. We're going to focus on questions facing decision makers and opportunities for collaboration between legislators, businesses, and employers. And employees strengthening America's economy. So I am thrilled to have Liz Wilke here, principal economist with Gusto, where they are researching the state of work and business in the modern economy. So in effort for time, we're just going to jump right into it.
Okay, great.
Okay, wonderful. So can you talk to me a little bit about how the employee-employer relationship has changed over the last few years?
I want to say that in a way that sort of gives the idea that it wasn't changing already, right? Technology the changing economy was already having an impact on that relationship. And then what we really did with COVID was we sort of compressed 10, 20, 30 years of that transformation into like a very small space. And so that is why I think everything feels so sort of hectic and a little bit uncertain and just way more volatile than it used to. But I mean, what we're sort of really seeing is, a talent shortage where employers are really trying to find the right skills in an entirely new, much more digitized economy. We are seeing the digital economy in the terms of platformization, right? It's just becoming easier for people to find alternate forms of work and for employers to find alternate types of employees and to use, their skills appropriately. We're also seeing a more shock-heavy world, right? Where both employers are feeling different risks from making very long-term commitments to employees. And we're also seeing shock-heavy worlds affecting employees and workers who realize that they need to diversify some of their household income streams, either with part-time work or, content creation or what have you. And I think just sort of all of that change has sort of come together all at once to really sort of start a renegotiation about what it means to have any type of employment relationship that no longer sort of wholly centered on that traditional employee-employer relationship that so much of our labor policy is built around.
So we've sort of found ourselves in this stars-aligned, perfect storm of everything coming together a little quicker than planned.
Everything, everywhere, all at once.
Yeah. So Connie mentioned, and you also talked a little bit about the alternative to the traditional employee set. Talk to me about independent contractors and what you're seeing about how they are part of the workforce in a different way now.
Yeah, so contractors are a part of what I currently use as shorthand as like the generation of the multimodal workforce, right? So all of the IRS research and sort of other literature that's been out there haven't really quantified a huge increase in the number of people who contract full-time, but they've seen a pretty substantial increase in the number of people who contract part-time or have ever contracted. And so what that's telling us is that people who maybe have full-time jobs or several part-time jobs or are doing a side gig are turning more and more to contracting. One, because it's just easier, and two, because employers are really feeling this demand shortage. And then businesses are also finding that it is easier to find the right skills. At Gusto, we did a survey of over 1,000 small businesses and how they use contractors, and 33% of them in 2020 said that it would be impossible or very, very difficult to have a profitable business without them. Wow. we think about independent contractors as sort of being sort of really big companies, but small companies are highly dependent on them. And 9 out of 10 of them said that they were going to use contractors at the same or an increased level going forward because they're so valuable. And we're, really just sort of seeing this trend where employers are thinking about, sort of pillars of their workforce, where I have employees and they do sort of specific things for me. They keep the culture together, they understand where we're going long term, and they are sort of building a lot of this stuff right out. And then contractors are sort of like a modular part of their workforce strategy, where I need, a web page designer, I need this, and sort of they're thinking less about who is a person that can do 6 things, but what are the 6 things that need to be done, and how can we get the best people right to do them for us?
That is a big change. Thank you. So one of the themes of today's events is reconnecting policymakers with the economic realities. Where are some places you feel like your data insights are not really matching up with the realities and what you're hearing here in DC?
Yeah, I think that there are 2 big things that we really need to talk about. And one is the sort of prevailing idea, or the sort of story that we've told ourselves a lot, that employee relationships are the best work relationships that can be had. And if you are an independent contractor, you are probably being exploited, and you would almost certainly prefer to be an employee of the person that you are working for. And when we have surveyed, and when other folks have surveyed, we find that that's just categorically untrue for the majority of contractors. Many of them are doing it part-time. Many of them are doing it 10 hours a week or less to earn extra money, to work on projects they find really fun, to develop their skills for a career transition, or just to pick their own projects. And I think that shifting our idea away from the centrality and first among everybody else about the types of employment relationships that are in fact out there, I think would allow us to think more about, okay, there is an employment relationship, and how do we build policy around that? And there's a contracting relationship. And there are in fact many different types of contracting relationships that we probably need to think about different policies for too. And then I think the second one is, in terms from a policy perspective, independent contractors, single person businesses are treated as businesses, and they are in many ways like businesses, and they are in many ways like people who need to work. And I think that we can think about how to make independent contractors sort of a special class of business, where they're not really an employee. They're definitely not really employees, but they're also not like a 10 or a 15 person business. Right. And I think that thinking about ways to streamline and support them to do taxes right in a compliant way, and to get access to healthcare in a very easy way, and to sort of understand that there's no HR person in the back for an independent contractor trying to sort all these things out. I think we could really build policy around them as sort of a middle path between employee and business.
Great. Well, Liz, thanks for sharing some really insightful research. If you all want to find out more, I'm sure Gusto has a good bit of information they can share. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Right. Well, our next guest needs no introduction, but I'll do it anyhow. Congressman Derek Kilmer is joining us today from Washington's 6th District. He has over a decade of experience working in economic development, and has made it a focus to get our economy and our Congress back to work. Most recently, and I have to say my top 3 favorite things about you is your work on the Committee for the Modernization of Congress. So I want to talk about that a little bit about that today. So thank you for your time, and we'll just jump right in. So as a leader in Congress on economic issues, what effects have you seen the dialogue and action in DC when it doesn't reflect reality out in the rest of the country?
Yeah. Can you hear me okay? Yes. So I look at it through sort of 3 principles. One, I worked in economic development before I got to Congress, and we had a sign up on the wall that said, "We are competing with everyone, everywhere, every day, forever," which I always found slightly intimidating. But I think that's a pretty good ethic, not just for folks who work in local economic development. I think it's a pretty good ethic for our country, too. Second, I think we have to embrace the principle that we need to have an economy that doesn't leave people or entire communities behind. I represent a region that used to export wood products all over the world. And in some of the communities now, the main export is young people. And that just doesn't work. And so you have to try to build an economy where no matter what zip code you live in, you got a shot. And the third principle is our ability to address number one and number two is hindered if we have a Congress that's focused on the wrong stuff. And so the folks I represent have zero patience for political bull. They just want us to solve their problems. They want us to embrace the notion that we are in a global competition, and they want to make sure that we're doing what we can to help their families and the communities in which they live.
That's great. That's great. So how is Congress implementing some of the Modernization Committee's recommendations despite the change in power this year, and recognizing that Congress often has to be pulled kicking and screaming into the next generation of things? What are you seeing with the implementation?
So for folks who haven't followed this, I chaired this committee called the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress, which sounds like we were the IT help desk, but it was nicknamed the Fix Congress Committee, which usually either got people to giggle or offered to pray for me. But very, very quietly, under the radar, our committee passed 202 recommendations focused on a simple goal of making Congress work better for the American people. Now, here's the cool thing. About 3/4 of them have either been implemented or are on the path toward implementation. The new majority, to their credit, realized that to implement this stuff, we can't take our eye off the ball. And so they are setting up a subcommittee under House Admin to focus on implementation of our committee's recommendations. So if you noticed, I'm going to be serving on House Admin also this year. That is why, because I want to make sure we're getting as many of these reforms across the finish line. And they're focused on some things that, I know many of you in this room that I think you'll appreciate. How do we have a Congress that is able to recruit and retain diverse staff? As an institution, our capacity to solve big problems is limited if we lose people really quickly and if we sort of self-lobotomize as an institution every few years. So a lot of the reforms are focused on that. We have a number of reforms that are focused on improving how Congress uses technology. Congress has been described as an 18th century institution using 20th century technology to solve 21st century problems. And I think that's actually pretty accurate. And so some of our recommendations are focused on how Congress uses technology better. And third, we have a number of recommendations that are focused on civility and collaboration. How, as an institution, can members actually work together to solve problems rather than just being the Hatfields and McCoys, throwing stuff across the gymnasium at each other.
Well, so I think that's important because the Select Committee was formed with an even number of Republicans and Democrats, right? And you worked in a very bipartisan way. Do you see any areas for potential bipartisanship on economic policy in this coming Congress?
For sure. I mean, so here's what I would say. I think it is underappreciated the number of big economic policies that passed in the last Congress that were bipartisan. Right? The infrastructure bill was bipartisan, and that's a game changer. It's the most, for years, Congress talked about infrastructure but didn't do anything. Now we have the most significant investment in infrastructure in decades. And so part of the focus needs to be on making sure that that is implemented in a way that recognizes that we're competing against everyone, everywhere, every day, forever, and that makes sure that we're not leaving communities behind. The CHIPS and Science Act is another great example of bipartisan legislation that passed in the last Congress. Making sure that that gets implemented in a way that is effective, I think, is important. There are other things in this Congress that I think can be bipartisan. The Farm Bill historically is bipartisan, and that's economic policy. Right. I think there's hope for, and I think it's, one of my biggest disappointments since I've been in Congress is the fact that we haven't been able to move the needle on immigration reform. But there are some components that passed the House in the last Congress that were bipartisan, things like the Farm Workforce Modernization Act. There are some proposals around immigration reform that I think can be bipartisan. That is also economic policy. And perhaps most importantly, we can't default. We cannot implode our nation's economy by being irresponsible. So that, in the end, will inevitably have to be a bipartisan solution, too.
Absolutely. What are some of the ways that you think the conversation around the economy can be modernized? How can we talk about it differently?
Yeah. Well, I mentioned the two principles up front that, to me, are ways to think about the economy. The reality is the nations with whom we compete are not farting around with government shutdowns and discussions of default. They want to eat our lunch, and I don't think we ought to let them. And so there are some key components of our competitiveness, things like investments in infrastructure, things like making sure that we have a workforce that's able to take on the jobs that are available today and that will be available tomorrow. Making sure that we have thoughtful policy around regulation, around taxation, that makes sure that we can grow jobs here in the United States rather than someplace else. Making sure that we have a modern trade policy so that we can export American products rather than exporting American jobs. These are all things that I think can drive the economic conversation for our country and should be driving the conversation for the Congress. And then the second piece of this is making sure that we're not leaving communities or people behind. To the credit of my colleague, Jim Himes, who ran the Committee on Economic Disparity. They put together, I think, a really good roadmap for things that can actually move the needle on making sure that people are able to succeed in this economy. That was, that report was bipartisan. And I think that also provides some opportunity for Congress.
If you could convey a message to employers or even employees sort of out in the community, what would you say to them about the future of America's economy and what your hopes are for it and how should they feel about it going forward?
I don't think I could be in this job if I wasn't a genetically hopeful person, right? I actually think that I would always bet on our country. That there's this interesting thing that happens. When I worked in economic development, you always had this dynamic where you were competing with these two oppositional forces. One that generally sort of talked down our economy and said like, this is the worst place to do business ever, and it's like so bad and we should all leave. And another that felt like when we did something significant, say pass an infrastructure bill, felt like we had checked the box and we were just done, right? And part of the reason that, literally I took this sign that I had up in my office when I worked in economic development, I brought it with me to Washington, D.C., is we're never done. We are never done competing. But at the same time, so the International Economic Development Council looks at how businesses make their location decisions. And the number one source of information that they use is not what a site selector says, it's not what some snazzy ad campaign says, it's what do businesses that are in that location say about doing business there. And so to some degree, like we have a responsibility as for those watching, those who are American business leaders, to sort of talk up the United States as a place in which to do business, to actually say we are a great place to do business, that we want the best and the brightest around the world to work here, that we want to make sure that we're making the most innovative products here in America rather than someplace else. But at the same time, we can say that and at the same time say, but we're not done. We have to make sure that we're continuing to improve our competitiveness as a nation.
That's great. Really appreciate your time. Thanks for scooting over here. I know you've got a busy day.
For sure.
I'll let you get back to it.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Take care. Thanks.
All right. So today we have joining us Antwanye Ford, President and CEO of Enlightened. We have Mayor Joyce Craig from the City of Manchester in New Hampshire. And we have County Executive Matt Meyer, Newcastle County in Delaware. So welcome. A little bit of a
forget it when you leave.
I'm not sure where. Hi, Mayor Craig.
Nice to see you. Thank you.
Hi, thanks, Clay. Appreciate it.
Right. Well, I'm going to start with you, Mayor Craig, if you don't mind. I'm familiar with your work growing Manchester's economies through creative partnerships. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the work that you've done in your city that's resulted in some newer high-paying jobs for the community?
Sure. First, I want to thank you for inviting me here. It's great to be with you, and it's great to listen to this conversation. I feel fortunate to be mayor of Manchester, a community who wants to participate in addressing our challenges and ensuring that we have a thriving economy. So it's both the residents and the businesses. And most recently, Manchester was one of 529 applicants for the Build Back Better Regional Challenge. We worked on that application for about a year. It included local government, industry, colleges in the city, so advanced manufacturing, Southern New Hampshire University, the University of New Hampshire, our transit authority, airport, and our city government. And we were fortunate to be one of 21 winners. There's $54 million coming into the city of Manchester, into the mill yard. The hope is that Manchester becomes an epicenter for biofabrication. Big component of that is workforce development. It's estimated to bring in about 7,000 direct jobs and over 30,000 indirect jobs. So we're really excited about this opportunity. And what's important to note, to your point, is they're family-sustaining jobs. And so we're working within our community to ensure that they are trained and able to take these jobs, which is what we need in our community.
I think that's a really great phrase, family-sustaining jobs, right? Because that's, that's sort of the number one goal that you want to get to.
Exactly.
You want to have that sort of continued community build. And so it's wonderful to hear about the BBB grant. So, Mr. Ford, you serve as a board member also for the National Association of Workforce Boards. And so it's my understanding it's dedicated to improvement of the workforce development industry. Is that right?
Yes, it is.
Wonderful. You're also a native Washingtonian.
Proud.
Proudly. So I think you have a unique perspective, given today's conversation, about how much of the DC dialogue is disconnected from economic realities. What have you seen in your experience? Because you're in the bubble, but you're also out of the bubble.
Yes.
So tell me a little bit about what you're experiencing.
Well, that's a great question, and I really appreciate that. One of the things that I think people have to realize is Washington is really two cities.
Yes.
We call it Washington, and then there's the District of Columbia, right? And that's the differentiation that happens. So most people, we're in the beautiful sort of, in the shadows of congressional power and political power, and then there's the city that's a part of it. And it's tough because in looking at that bubble, most people don't believe we really live here. And so people don't see the economic problems that we have. So they'll see beautiful downtown, they'll see the economic development, they'll see the areas of the city that has been incredibly powerful and grown. But then there's the community that happens. And as an example, we have a 20-year difference in life expectancy depending on what zip code you live in the particular city that we have. We have a massive wealth gap. I'll give you an example of this is in Washington, D.C. alone, the average white family wealth is $284,000. For a black family, it's $3,500.
Wow.
81 times the wealth. But that's hidden in the bubble that we talk about. And from a jobless perspective, and what the National Association of Workforce Boards is doing and what we do locally is to really try to decrease that gap. And that's where the workforce legislation we're looking at to make sure we're looking at stackable credentials and things and ensuring that we look at the large businesses and make them part of the solution. Because if you look at where we are, we have a situation where people want to hire people. And then we have an untapped reservoir of people. And so how do we make sure we connect these folks with the laws that we have in the country to make sure we're doing things to have these communities meet each other in the same bubble?
That's great. Those are some staggering numbers. So thank you for sharing those with us. Well, County Executive Meyer, I love your background as an educator, particularly as a math teacher, as the daughter of a high school math teacher. I truly appreciate the commitment that takes. And I think it's brought a lot of perspective to your current position. Can you tell us about one or two of the programs you found success with in Delaware? I think the case studies are really important for people to understand. One of the ones that I was most intrigued by was the 1,000 Kids Coding. And then also at the Jobs Now program. Can you share a little bit about both of those?
First of all, thank you, Corey, to the Well News Modern Economy Project. I appreciate, as Mayor Craig said, I don't come uptown very often. I started my career teaching in Anacostia. I was a fourth grade Teach for America teacher, Randall Highlands Elementary. Anybody here from Randall Highlands? Yeah. We didn't come to the steakhouse for breakfast very often, shall I say. So we appreciate everyone being here today, and also you inviting us very often. I don't know how Mayor Craig feels, but we turn on the TV and see what's being talked about in Washington. It has just about no relationship to the kind of problems we're working on every day. We had a big sewer pipe break 2 days ago, and I had to figure out how to fix it. It wasn't a Democrat problem or a Republican problem. It was a flushing the toilets problem. We have all sorts of policing issues, job creation, families supporting job stuff we have to get done every day. Gridlock is not an option in our world, and I appreciate you inviting us here, making a statement that our voice and our views matter. So Delaware, 35 years ago, we had a phenomenon in Delaware, which is a small state, about a million people, called Daddy Doopy. We called it when I grew up, everybody had Daddy Doopy. About half of my friends, their parents worked for one company called the DuPont Company. Delaware is different, that the whole state is was sort of captured by this single company. But I think it's a phenomenon in many small places across this country. And that company took care of people, took care of the community, funded many of our nonprofits, and quite frankly, if they wanted something passed through the state or local legislature, they would pretty much get what they want. That DuPont that had 35,000 employees, now with considerable population growth, has about 4,000 employees. So it's not what it was. The community can't lean on that single company the way it could. This company that was basically the community, an extension of family, is gone. And I think that's happened in many communities across the country. What it's being replaced with, I think, is one of the things we're all grappling with. Now, some people look back and say, well, wait a second, that Daddy Doopy was white male, people that had intergenerational wealth that controlled our community, and that's true. And so the question is, can we now, with this new economy, build something that's more equal? You mentioned 1,000 kids coding. In part because of my educational inclination, we're really looking hard at workforce training for kids and for adults. I have a belief that our education system was built in the 19th century and is still training people like we're in the 19th century for a sort of industrial economy. If you look at what our students are learning, we were talking before in our community, in many communities across this country and nationally, a situation where there are more jobs available than there are people looking for work. That kind of sounds like a good thing, right? That means everybody should have a job, but they don't. And I think one big reason they don't is the skills mismatch, that the people looking for work don't have the skills, often technology skills, that they need. So we developed a program, and I see that as a failure of our education system, a failure of our training programs. So we developed a program where 1,000 young people, and in DC, 1,000 is maybe not that big. In Delaware, it's a whole lot of people. 1,000 young people, we train them after school summers. Young people, primarily students of color, primarily have little to no access to producer technology, rather than they're all into the consumer technology, but don't get to produce. We teach them to be software developers from the age of 13.
You know, it's interesting because going back to what Congressman Kilmer was saying about what businesses look for in communities, I think education is such a huge component of that. What is going to feed into their workforce? And I think, particularly having 2 young children myself, the interesting thing about teaching coding, it's not necessarily just about the end of the day having software engineers or software developers. It's about complex thought. It's about, thinking through different processes and sort of some executive functioning. And so I think it's wonderful. And how long has it been going on so far?
We started it in 2018 with a ridiculous, audacious goal that nobody believed of training 1,000 kids, and we're at about 1,300 kids now. COVID, I don't know if I'm allowed to say this phrase, but COVID helped because when it was something that kids could continue doing, and we had plentiful funding thanks to the work of Representative Kilmer and the federal government. We had plentiful funding to fund programs like that. We did adjacent programs. We had a program during COVID where we took primarily bartenders, restaurant employees who were out of work and were at home, and paid them to train them in coding for a 3 to 6 month period. And we're finding about 80% of those employees have not gone back to the restaurant industry, which sometimes makes our restaurant association a little mad at me, but they're getting sort of higher paying jobs.
Well, we'll take the silver linings of the pandemic where we can get them, right? Absolutely. Mayor Craig, you mentioned the regional grant competition that you won the grant from. Can you talk a little bit about how employers and local communities can successfully collaborate, and what you saw as a success in your city and how that aided the grant competition?
Yeah, so the grant that I mentioned, we worked, like I said, for a year together in building that application. So we're bringing education to the forefront to provide the workforce training that's so desperately needed for our youth and for individuals in our community who don't have a job right now. The industry, they're going to be building out manufacturing space and startup collaboratives. So we're bringing businesses into the city of Manchester, new businesses, new jobs, which is desperately needed. And then the city government is looking at making sure that transportation is available, and because it's necessary, again, to get individuals to these jobs from different parts of the city. So it's a collaborative effort. We've done a number of things like this, and again, I feel fortunate for this in our community. Our business, talking about education, our business community came together about 4 years ago saying public schools are integral to the success of our businesses here in the city of Manchester. So they developed a nonprofit called Manchester Proud and have raised millions of dollars for our public school system, which is underfunded. We now have a strategic plan to follow. We've been able to hire an equity director and other necessary positions in the district. We've been able to bring forward curriculum. And again, we're making sure that the students have the curriculum necessary to meet the job needs in our local community. So I'm very grateful for the businesses in Manchester and their willingness to participate to ensure the success of our community and our residents.
That's great. Mr. Ford, as not only a business owner, but someone who works on workforce sports, can you talk to us a little bit about the concerns about the future of the American economy that you're hearing from not only employers, but employees across the board?
That's a great question. And one of the things I see people have concerns about is, first one, how do we get people back to work, right? And so you have this issue. Local cities, we've talked about this in the back, where the local economy is saying, we need people to go to our restaurants, our hotels. Business owners are like, I need people to come back. The paradigm has shifted, I want to work home. So business owners and you've been seeing this in the news, I want people to come back. People are like, well, I can go to another job. And it's tough because you have this cycle of, we have this new paradigm of the hybrid workforce, but yet every city we've talked about in the back has restaurants, hotels that need this type of work. And so we're laying people off. So we're inherently creating an environment where we're supporting unemployment by having people not come back because our paradigm has changed. And I think business owners, both large and small, are trying to say, how do I survive in this new paradigm? We've recently seen the technology industry do a correction now because we put too much fat in it because it was engineered for the pandemic. And now that we're sort of reverse engineering, we got to sort of figure this out. And I think employers are now looking to say, what do we do more effectively to adapt to the hybrid world? How do we make sure our downtowns and our suburban areas still have workforce that people live and work where they are? And how do we stimulate this economy with more entrepreneurship and innovation? And I think one of the things that we're trying to do is have both the workforce boards and I see right, the U.S. Black Chamber of Commerce is here where I serve as the vice chair. How do we make sure we're creating this economic principle and this bubble between workforce, economic development, entrepreneurship, and getting the large business partnerships that have been important? And so we've been creating these ecosystems with large businesses, working with mid-sized to smalls to try to, because we're all in this situation together.
Absolutely. No, it's very interesting. Mr. Meyer, I wanted to go back to something that you said about not always being a part of the conversation, and I think that's really important. Can you share with us something that you wish policymakers in DC understood about employers and their communities and local governments at the level of government in which you work that maybe they're not always understanding? It's not being reflected.
Right. Yeah. So it was. So to be clear, in Delaware and in many small states, we have a great relationship with our federal delegation, with senators, congresspersons. So it's hard for me to think of a problem that I'm having that I haven't let Senator Coons, Senator Carper, Representative Rochester know about in depth. So it's hard to.
What about agencies, regulations, and all those sorts of things?
To generalize. One thing I think about a lot that I don't think there's a whole national, there's a lot of conversation about mental health. I think a source problem of much, not all, but much of the mental health crisis, like you start to think, why does it feel so much worse today than it did 10, 20, 30 years ago? But the problems I see in my community, whether it's something dramatic and life-threatening like opiate use, or just sort of a general malaise and negativity in a sense among a lot of people, that the next generation of America may not be more prosperous than the last generation. I felt like when I was a kid, there wasn't that sensibility. I think, again, going back to I think a lot of it goes back to that daddy doopy. There was sort of an economy a generation ago that I think a lot of people felt like would take, if you got into the big company, it would take care of you and you would take care of it, and that's gone. And we're trying to figure out and negotiate in our community what that mean. What does that mean if people maybe don't have the allegiance to the employer that they used to have because the employer doesn't have the allegiance to them? Because a private equity firm, may have a leveraged buyout and see opportunities to get more dollars or short-term financial gain and dispose of you and your family, right? There's beyond all the financial stuff we talk about and how to make healthcare and benefits portable, there's a mental health aspect too. I think a lot of what's going on in our community, that's what I see.
Understandable. I'm going to open it up for questions again, but if you don't have any, I got you covered because I could talk about this all day long. Anybody have questions out in the audience?
Hi, I was curious what age group you start educating for the 1,000 Kids Coding.
What's your name?
My name's Josh. I'm with Third Way.
Oh, Third Way, great. Nice to see you, Josh. We started 14 to 20, which was our we have a summer youth employment program. In our county government, we don't run schools. And so we did it through our summer youth employment program. I like to call it an envelope licking, lawn mowing youth employment program where it's sort of, we teach you to show up on time and do the basics. And my goal was to transform it into serious job training. We did it with 14 to 20-year-olds the first summer, which was our standard summer youth employment age. The first summer we did it, there were two primary complaints. One was there were 12 and 13-year-olds who felt like, younger siblings who felt like they could code too. So we've gone down to 13. And the other complaint was they were upset at the end of the summer when they had to stop doing it. So it was like a 12-week intensive course. So now we have an around the year cohort as well. But right now we're starting at 13. My experience as a fourth grade teacher, I mean, when you were talking about coding, right down the street here, I don't know how to say this, especially with cameras on me, controlling a math class as a very well-educated, well-trained teacher, sometimes as few as 12 or 13 fourth graders can be more challenging than you believe when you're teaching math. When you're teaching software development, it's incredibly easy. Kids who traditionally were not engaged, maybe didn't do their homework last night, the night before that, maybe didn't eat breakfast. When you, for whatever reason, you put them in front of a right engaging, at 8, 9 years old, you can do pre-programming activities because of some of the logistics of the program. We're starting at 13 now.
I think there was a question in back.
Hi, I'm Lizzie. You talk frequently about workforce development throughout this morning, and I was just curious what you guys believe is the responsibility for businesses to upskill, and then for the small businesses who don't necessarily have the resources to upskill their employees, how can federal and local government step in to fill those gaps?
Absolutely love that question. One of the biggest programs I think we're not taking advantage of is the work-based learning program that there's money available. I'll give you an example. And I'll talk about the District of Columbia. One of the things that we have, and every major city has this, is you have the ability, if you identify the job, Department of Labor has provided funds that you can underwrite up to 75% of the salary for 6 months while you're training this person, right? The beauty of that for small business over mid-sized businesses is that you have a resource that you're training and adapting to your culture, that the money is available. And then if you're looking to hire that person within 6 months, you've trained them on what you want, the credentials that you want, and your culture. The money's available. I don't think one of the things that National Association of Workforce Board is trying to make sure we do is make sure our local workforce boards are pushing this information to the businesses. And so it's businesses of all sizes. I think the other thing that businesses can do in working with our workforce boards and our chambers is making sure they give the needs and the projections about what they need, right? Supply and demand. You know this from your perspective, right? I need these things. I'm going to be winning these contracts. I have these needs in the future. I want these types of workers. Can you make themselves available? And by the way, here's the curriculum that I would like to provide to you so they're trained specifically for what I need. You eliminate excuses that way because I provided you what I've needed. You've trained to that standard, and now you've provided that to me. I find that very, very hard to say that you can't solve that problem.
Well, I think that's an important point because there could be all the amazing programs and all the amazing support from a government level, but if the people who need to use them aren't aware of them, then it goes nowhere. So is there a disconnect in the communication between what's available and the utilization? We all know that business owners, particularly small businesses, they're spread so thin. What is that communication chain and how can we improve that?
I think we need massive marketing and outreach programs. because I come against this all the time. I didn't know. I wish I had known about this. And I think you have to make sure this is something that we embed in every form of communication about unemployment and employment and underemployment, that the federal government has resources that honestly are underutilized at this point. But we have to make sure that's a marketing program, that's an outreach program. We're talking about Council of Mayors. I think every mayor in the country, you're gonna take care of that one, right? Needs to know about this, right? Because you can push it from a perspective, but if it's not pushed down and said, it's money, there's no gotcha, and it's not a catch to using this thing, we can really deal with the problems I think that we have. And the government has made the funding available, but you have to proactively push that information.
You know, I want to sort of end on one overarching question. I'd like to hear from each of you. Maybe we can start with you, Mayor Craig. So the pandemic led to major changes in America's economy. There's no doubt about it. Flexibility in the workplace is more common now, and we have sort of been discussing and seeing this so-called great resignation, many people reassessing their relationships with work, their work-life balance. What do you think will be the most enduring changes to the economy in our post-pandemic era?
It's a really good question. You know, one of the things that we've talked about is the effect on our downtown. So what we are seeing in Manchester is individuals still are working remote or working hybrid. So we are seeing less people in our downtown, but we're seeing a shift. So we are seeing more people, and that's what we need to do. And it's, again, working with our businesses, working with industry to make sure they understand the impact that that has on our local economy. We've got to encourage and incentivize them to come back to the office space and, you know, participate in our local economy. That's what's going to make us whole. So that's my hope.
Gotcha. Mr. Meyer?
I hope the lasting legacy of COVID is a moral imperative to address the inequities across our communities and across our country. I think as Americans, for whatever reason, we find it acceptable if one person or one family or one entire community or demographic group lives in bigger houses and is able to have, you know, more luxurious jobs and buy more luxurious things than somebody else. But when there's something like a COVID and that population is not really dying, but this other population is dying, I hope we stand up and say that's not acceptable. I think with respect to public health in particular, with respect to the comorbidities of COVID that actually are sort of festering in communities across our county and I think across our country every day, now is the time for us to address those things so that when the next crisis comes, if, you know, my main talking point when COVID started is like, okay, at least maybe this is something that'll bring us together, right? This is a virus that affects the human body the same, no matter where you are or where you live. Of course, it turned out that the irony is it didn't really work out that way. More vulnerable communities across our county and I think across the country were hit much harder with death. And that's a fundamental inequality that is so un-American, and I hope we all work to address that.
Lasting impacts to the economy post-COVID?
I think one of the things is to embrace the inequities that we have. I think one of the things that we've seen, particularly in the Black business community, was how big the inequities were. And I think you see that in the Black community, you see that in the Hispanic community, you see that in, you know, with women. And I think we've started to embrace that. And I think we've sort of said, let's not ignore that thing that we used to put under the carpet, but let's embrace it at this point. And I think the programs have started to do that. I just think that from a legislative perspective, we have to make sure that if we make, you know, the bills, the broadband bill, the infrastructure bill, that we embed the fact that there are inequities that we have to embrace the entire time that those things are involved. And I think as we do that as a country, we become more effective because we're dealing with the truths.
Absolutely. Well, thank you to all three of you for participating in this conversation. It was a pleasure. I learned quite a bit. Thank you to our audience, also to our partners, the Modern Economy Project, and TechNet. And to those of you who are streaming online, thank you for joining us, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day.